going to pick up where we left off, and that is with the interrogators, I think I should call them, asking Dr. Leary about his sanity, as if dropping a little acid may have done him some harm. And as ridiculous as that sounds today, back in 1976 in Houston, when these questions were being asked, well, it was the height of the U.S. government's disinformation campaign about LSD. But as you're about to hear, Timothy Leary didn't let those in-your-face questions about his sanity bother him in the least.
How can you defend your sanity anywhere, anyhow, particularly in a rather insane world? It's the old parable that in a very insane society, a sane person is considered eccentric, and seeing too much can make you look or act different. But no, I'm very happy with my sanity.
I was wondering if, as far as I know, you've not had any neurological examinations or anything like that when you were in prison. I think I have read it published that you did have some extensive psychological testing at one point that involved the Leary battery, that had some IQ testing. I think that the issue of being brain damaged is that information correct, that you have had testing? And if
yes,
so,
when I was first brought into the California prison system in 1970, they gave me the standard battery of tests, including some tests that I designed myself. I wrote about this in the book Confessions of the Hope Fiend. After all, looked at it pragmatically, the trick of taking intelligence tests is to get the highest score possible in terms of the intelligence that's defined by the middle-class intellectuals who designed the test, so that my IQ test came out very high. Then, during my escape trial in, I believe it was April 1973, this is after I was kidnapped and brought back, because so much rumor is going on about my mental capacity, I called in a battery of neurologists and psychologists, including some employed by the state of California, and one man who worked for Santa Cruz County, and I had them give me a intelligence test, and I came out at the genius level. But that's, again, after all, I understand psychological tests, so that I was more going through a performance than proving anything to myself.
Do you feel that performance made any difference as far as your image to people, that it did anything to dispel those negative images that were created about you?
No, I don't think so. Anyone, you have to be very realistic about this. In a perfect democracy, every election would end in a tie. That is, the issues would be so presented that 50% would be pro, 50% would be con. My point is that any time you enter the public arena and start broadcasting signals, the best you can expect for is a 50-50 break, that half are going to like it and half won't. In the case of ideas that are so futuristic and so powerful as the ones that I've been transmitting, you're lucky if you get 15 or 20% of the people that will listen to you. The advantage is that it's going to be the most courageous and intelligent and open-minded 15 or 20%, so you got a lot going for you. But it's the nature of the game that a philosopher who's proposing radical new ideas will be opposed by 80% of society. Look at Semmelweis, the great the physician who discovered infectious diseases. He ended up totally ostracized and busted. Look at Pasteur, who was laughed at. Look at Galileo. Not that I'm comparing myself with these people, but I'm simply defining the nature of the game. I'm not at all interested in image. People talk to me about my image, and I laugh at them. I'm interested in communicating with the 10% of the human race who's ready to migrate, ready to mutate, ready to move on, ready to change. And it's a hopeless proposition. See, if you try to please everybody, you get into a Carter-Ford election, that you're so bland and you're so custard-like in your statements that you're not saying anything. I expect and welcome 80% skepticism to my ideas, because the ideas that I'm transmitting are extremely challenging to our conceptions of human nature. And it's to be expected and welcome that the mass of society will not accept them readily.
You know, one of the images, and I guess it's concerned me as a, as a psychologist and getting into a field that you have been in, is that the charges that you were professionally irresponsible in advocating these futuristic ideas rather than staying within the more traditional domain of the field. And I wonder, what do you think about, what have you been responsible to? Been responsible to the limitations that the field has lived within. What have you been responsible to?
Well, from an early age, I've been interested in only one thing, and that is what is it all about? Why am I here? Why is the human species here? Where are we going? What's the directional cause of our problems, and how can we get our compass bearings so that we can move smoothly with the evolutionary currents? So my responsibility now is to the DNA code. My thinking is obsessed with evolutionary notions. I see myself and our species as robot participants in evolutionary processes. Now, the interesting thing about our robothood, and we're all robots, we're 99% robots. We're stamped out by DNA code the way Chryslers and Pontiacs and Fords are stamped out from the great factories and mass assembly lines. I said 99%, and it's the 1% of us, of our nervous system, 1% possibility that we can decipher the instructions that came on the package. That we are the robots who can open up the panels and look within and find out how our brains work and how our brains intersect with the RNA and DNA. We are the robots who can figure out the nature of our own robothood and start asking the post-robot questions of what does she want? Well, what's the purpose? Why are we here? So my responsibility, to repeat, is to the genetic process and the evolutionary process as I see it. Now, this is an extremely fun position to take. It makes you very good-natured about human nature. I don't get involved in us and thems. I see us all playing parts in the evolutionary process. It leads to a very gentle and embracing notion of human nature, and it does encourage change. My responsibility is to change myself, to keep myself open. People say to me, well, how come you change so much? You're not leading a light brigade charge back to Woodstock, and you're not saying what you said in the 60s. I say, well, come on, why haven't you changed? Everything's changed since the 60s. The lessons have been learned. The great discoveries from the 60s are now part and parcel of the American consumer mentality. There are new change issues involved now, and I try to keep in touch with them.
I guess maybe that could kind of focus us back more concretely on your being here tonight and what you're doing in Houston and how you're actually spending your time now as an evolutionary agent and as this vision that you have of our future.
Evolution is moving very quickly these days, and the script writers are shoving new scripts on us at a very rapid rate, and I take it for granted that I change from season to season.
Well, maybe you can tell us about what scripts you see right now as the current ones.
Well, there's only one script, as I said before, and that's change. That's the message of DNA. Specifically, there are 4 very practical, concrete techniques that the DNA code uses to help evolution. And interestingly enough, these are all M's to make it easy to remember. There's mutation. Mutation is the way that a species changes. Then there's metamorphosis, or molting. That's how an individual changes. And each one of us has gone through at least 4 molts or metamorphoses in our life. We were little babies with big heads and small bodies, and then we learned how to crawl, then we learned how to talk and walk. Then we learned to be domesticated sexual impersonators, which defines the civilized domesticated ape. Some of us have moved to more complex energy mutations or metamorphoses. A third element of change, a third technique of DNA code, and this is the classic one, is migration. We all are the result of migrations. We started off under the water, and then we moved on to the shoreline, and we moved on to the prairie. We developed forepaws, and we stood up on our 2 hind feet. We're moving faster. We're moving farther. That's the history of the evolution of life on this planet. So migration is the third form of change, and the fourth, and that's why I'm in this room. I think why all of us are in this room. The fourth technique of the DNA code is media or marketing. It doesn't do any good to have a good idea unless somehow you can hook it up to energy and send it out. And then again, the good idea is no good unless it's received by those who are ready to receive it and bring about changes. So that I'm very involved in media these days because I think I do have some new ideas that our species needs, particularly younger people are looking for new ideas, I think. And these ideas, to answer your question finally, Henry, have to do with migration and mutation, metamorphosis. That is, 3 ideas which I think are currently hot. Not hot in a marketplace fad sense, but evolutionarily hot. The 3 ideas that the DNA code is now popping on us are space migration. We're realizing that we are not terrestrials, that some of us are supposed to leave the planet and to start moving around in post-terrestrial spaces. And the second new idea is intelligence increase. We can be exactly as smart as we want to be. Our intelligence is limited exactly by our own laziness and our own apprehensions that if you get too smart, you're in trouble. Because I'm here to tell you, if you get too smart, you're in trouble. And the third new idea, which I think is inevitable and for which we are ready, is life extension. Scientists tell us that we could double the lifespan within 3 or 4 years. These 3 ideas go together. We've used the acronym SMILE, S-M-I-2-L-E, Space Migration, Intelligence, Increase, and Life Extension, to nail down this basic point that these 3 things go together, and one without the other 2 would lead to farce or nightmare.
Well, since you've already, when you discussed the second of the M's, metamorphosis, outlined the first 4 sections of the periodic table of energy, which is a rough chart for the indications thus far that you've found as to the directions that intelligence increase goes. Would you care to outline that portion of it first? Rough methodology of the intelligence increase?
Talking about like the first 4 circuits of the nervous system?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, refer to it.
Everyone who's listening to this program, who is adolescents or post-adolescent, has gone through 4 metamorphoses or 4 molts in your lifetime. As I say, you were a tiny baby once, almost a marine creature. You couldn't walk, you had to be supported and carried. And at that time, you had one circuit of your brain which was interested only in biological survival, food, warmth. Then you migrated and mutated a second time when you left your mother's arms. That was a big migration. Wow, compared to the migration from Europe to America, leaving your mother's arms was a tremendous feat. And each one of these mutation migrations that we go through individually, it's a very stormy period in the individual's life. And I think that any one of our of our listeners who could look back would remember these periods of transition, because it literally is a death, or you're giving up the security of your mother's arms to crawl around down there on the floor. It's very dangerous, where people like to step on you, and all these huge monsters that are playing these games of power and status and territory, what's mine, what's yours, and you're too weak to really defend yourself. So these periods of migration and these periods of metamorphosis are always fraught with emotion and anxiety, and that, of course, what's happening today in America. We have to be very gentle with each other because we are going through a period of mutation. Okay, so the second circuit of your nervous system is the emotional aspect, where you're learning to deal with power, status, pecking order, and then you develop all these techniques of camouflage or pretense weakness, or all the mammalian reactions that we call emotions, and which our Shakespearean dramatists tend to glorify far beyond their primitive state. Anyway, the third mutation takes place when the left hemisphere of your brain kicks into operation, and you learn how to use the 9 muscles of your vocal cord, and you learn to use your thumb and your hand to manipulate symbols. This mutation, which each one of us went through, is again accompanied by a migration, because we migrated from the local, from your home, and you moved down to the kindergarten and to the primary school, and as your symbol facilities developed, you moved up to grammar school and the high school. Then the fourth great mutation, and certainly no one can deny that a tremendous transformation took place in our physiology and our neurology when adolescence develops, and all those protuberances and hair growth suddenly began popping out, and light bulbs went off in our heads as the fourth circuit of our nervous system told us that there was a new game to be played, which has to do with sperm egg arrangements and mating and grooming and essentially the selection of a sex role. We're all sex impersonators. We learn during adolescence to pick up one of many sex roles, and we try them out, and we finally settle on one. And when we've done that, we become a domesticated member of the herd or the anthill, and we've completed the terrestrial cycle of life. Well, we call these the first 4 circuits. These are the first 4 terrestrial survival techniques, and you have to master these before you can go on.
Well, obviously, these are common circuitry. They're common experience, and obviously the state of consciousness on the planet today is aware of the fact that those 4 circuits are not adequate to the needs that an increasing amount of human beings are discovering. The turbulence in the 60s being that, showing definite major social signs of the chafing. Do the next 4, there are 4 more circuits, and how do they resolve the bind that we've obviously gotten ourselves into? I mean, this bind has led most of the Third Circuit masters of the world to predict imminent doom, imminently. Mm-hmm. And what is the alternative?
Well, before I outline there are 4 stages of evolution which are going to come within the lifetimes of most of the listeners of this program. But before I go into the next 4 stages of evolution, I'd like to remind our listeners that the 4 mutations that we've gone through, 4 migrations that we've gone through as individuals, which took us from our mother's arms to the point of socio-sexual domestication, have recapitulated the 4 great movements in the evolution of species. We all started off as marine creatures. We were all amoebas once under the water, and then we've gone through the same cycle of mutation and migration. And I'm sure that all these cycles in history have produced the turmoil that we saw in the 60s. I'm sure that when several 100 million years ago, perhaps over 1 billion years ago, in some of these tidal pools, there was a youth rebellion and a drug rebellion when some of the amoebas began hanging out in places and overdosing on dangerous drugs like calcium. Now, when that happened, the establishment amoebas got together and said, well, do you know what? It's proven scientifically that if you overdose on calcium, you mutate. It breaks your chromosomes and you develop bones. And if God had wanted amoeba to have bones, he wouldn't have made calcium illegal. This process of evolution has always involved mutations which shake up the species at the moment and lead to a migration. I'm sure when we climbed out on the shoreline, again there was a great upset among the marine creatures that some of the young fish were lying around on shorelines digging the radiation and not playing fish games and overdosing on dangerous drugs like oxygen. And which, of course, if you fool around with drugs like oxygen, you know what happens? You develop lungs. And we don't want any self-respecting fish with lungs.
Well, what'll happen when the gills are gone?
Yeah, right.
The mystery will be
yeah,
gone.
Right. So, the interesting thing is that, I keep repeating this to people because I think it's a signal you need. We're all evolving, and it's our role to be mutants, and it's time to evolve again. And if you're not evolving, you're in trouble unless you're consciously resting and waiting for the next mutation and migration to take place. We're all migrants too, and sure, there are some people that stayed back in the water and they're still there. Most Europeans, you see, had the chance to come over to this new world, but they didn't migrate. They didn't want to take that chance. And so it's true that as we move into the future, some will migrate and mutate and some won't. We must be very gentle with each other and not get involved in genocidal chauvinisms here, because it is all one life web that we call these the first four circuits. These are the first four terrestrial survival techniques, and you have to master these before you can go on.
These are common circuitry. They're common experience, and obviously the state of consciousness on the planet today is aware of the fact that those four circuits are not adequate to the needs that an increasing amount of human beings are discovering. The turbulence in the 60s showing definite major social signs of the chafing. There are four more circuits, and how do they resolve the bind that we've obviously gotten ourselves into? I mean, this bind has led most of the Third Circuit masters of the world to predict imminent doom. What is the alternative?
There are four stages of evolution which are going to come within the lifetimes of most of the listeners of this program. But before I go into the next four stages of evolution, I'd like to remind our listeners that the four mutations that we've gone through, the four migrations that we've gone through as individuals, which took us from our mother's arms to the point of socio-sexual domestication, have recapitulated the four great movements in the evolution of species. We all started off as marine creatures. We were all amoebas once under the water. And then we've gone through the same cycle of mutation and migration. And I'm sure that all these cycles in history have produced the turmoil that we saw in the 60s. To finally come back to your question about the next four movements, I wanted the listeners to understand that this is not just individual, but that the species itself is moving. The next great mutation and migration in the life process on this planet is going to involve space migration. Now, I want to point out that space migration is not Buck Rogers, rockets, it doesn't involve any of this galactic cowboys and Indians of Star Trek. Space migration is the most mundane thing, if you pardon the pun. We're simply going to build out there in lunar Earth orbit cylinders which are between 10 and 30 miles long, in which the landscape will be exactly like the landscape that's preferred down here. there will be as many as 20 or possibly even 30 cities like Houston or Lake Tahoe or Portofino in Italy or Stad's ski resorts. Matter of fact, for those of you who are, really want to get the feeling for space migration, as you walk around your hometown right now, imagine that you're in a space cylinder. But just imagine that over the horizon there's an Algerian sand dune, or just over the other hill there's a Swiss ski resort. Matter of fact, you could, I'm thinking of making a movie in which we demonstrate that you could transplant Earthlings and put them in one of these space cylinders, and it would take them a long time to figure out that they were really living in space, because essentially, of course, the Earth is a spaceship itself.
Do you really think that man can be so presumptuous as to come anywhere near the beauty, subtlety, and ecology of the landscape of the Earth as it is naturally evolved?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Judeo-Christian philosophy tells us that man has fallen, original sin. And there's always this notion that we're incompetence and that we're somehow cluttering up. There's a new ecological morality that I believe in ecological consciousness, but I don't believe in ecological morality or ecological lawmaking. Now, I absolutely refuse to be strapped into a seatbelt. I'll walk before I'll let buzzers tell me that I have to have. I'll take my chances, and I won't complain if I get hurt. But there's this notion that man is presumptuous. Now, I believe that the DNA code has pre-programmed everything. I think it's all perfect. I think that humanity is playing its part, just as every species plays its part. Every protein molecule plays its part in a design which has been worked out. And what's happening on this planet is happening on literally billions of planets like ours throughout our local galaxy alone. We think we're rather unique. Actually, we're just frogs in a little pond, and in our area of the galaxy alone, there are millions of little frog pond planets like ours in which we're evolving exactly as we are here. As a matter of fact, I suspect, this is belief and not fact. Most everything I'm saying in this program comes from scientists. I'm not making any of this up. I'm passing on the findings of Gerard O'Neill and of the NASA committees who study space migration. And when we get the life extension, I'm passing on the findings of geneticists and biologists. But now I'll give you a belief, or I'll give you a fun fantasy. I find it useful and entertaining and stimulating to my intelligence to believe, quote, believe, that we're cloned here, and that we will find ourselves seated on millions of other planets. So then you get the question of who seeded us, or are we presumptuous to terraform a planet, or are we being presumptuous to take over nature's role in building new worlds? No, that's what we're supposed to do. Think of us as simple, humble gardeners, or the human species now is like a Teamsters union. It's our job just to build the ships to get us up there, to get, not by us, I mean all forms of life, because we got to take all forms of life with us. I think that's the Noah's Ark metaphor is one of the most pervasive throughout human philosophy. Almost every tribe and primitive island religious group has their Noah's Ark myth, that some catastrophe was going to happen, and so they got together and they took two of each species. I think that's where it's at, and I think that's our role. It's neither presumptuous, nor is it original sin Judeo-Christian put down of human species. We're simply programmed at the right time to play this robot role of getting all life off the planet.
Oh, I can see that, and accept it or reject it. It doesn't really make any difference. But I mean, that's quite a substantially different thing. Saying that we're programmed, we're designed to move into space, to start traveling in space, to start understanding the immensity out there, which has mysteries in it, which dwarf the mysteries of our Mother Earth. But I can't go along with you when you say living in a tin can can come anywhere near living on the surface of good old Mother Earth.
That becomes a matter of aesthetics. You see, I see us now I could give you a dozen metaphors. It's 1493. Now, we're sitting around in a coffee shop in Lisbon, Spain, and I say, hey, man, this guy Columbus come back, and the world is round, it's not flat, and there's all this land over there. And you say, well, I'd rather stay here and go. There are no cathedrals over there, and come on, they had a good wine over there. Okay, baby, you stay. Let us go. Well, then we'll come back and we'll bring you. And then there's options always open. You can change your mind. I think these conversations are necessary. I think these conversations we're having took place when we were underwater, deciding, well, we're going to climb out there and try it out. As long as I know you won't put us in jail or keep us from trying it, and I know you'll keep your eyes open and your ears open and see how we do, and I think you're ready to change your mind. It's not a tin can. As a matter of fact, think of most people on this planet live in tin cans, namely motor cars, right? And they live in these funny little hunky-dunk, condominium apartments. See, the facts of the matter are, in space, you can have up to 5 acres, perhaps even more, and you can design exactly as you want. The cylinders, far from being tin cans, there'll be no manufacturing or agriculture in the 30-mile residence. That'll all be outside. So the 30 miles will be an incredible park. Who but the greatest millionaires have 30 miles of landscape to wander around in, and no cars, and no see down here we climb into these tin cans with pneumatic rubber tires. Up there, sure, there'll be little cylinders outside for those who want a hot rod drag. The beauty about space migration is everything you do down here you can bring up there, except for destructive. If you want to have little cylinders where people want to shoot out and get drunk Saturday night, and sure they can do it. We'll build little cylinders for Hell's Angels where they can fight with each other. We're not against really anything. We want to give everybody the space to do their own thing. So it's not tin cans. I think for most people, the quality of life and the relationship to nature will be much, and also there's the glory and the creativity of creating landscape. We're reserving the DNA code to bring the soil there and to work out an ecological system. Of course, this is Los Angeles thinking. Now, the thing about Los Angeles, which is amusing, those of you men there, 50 years ago, Los Angeles was a desert. And look at it now. Nowhere on the planet has the average person, an average middle-class person, put more effort into beautifying the environment. Now, it's all man-made. It's all human-made. But still, it's kind of, and Los Angeles is funny, too, because people lived out their visions there. You'll have Babylonian temples and Mexican haciendas and, Cape Cod cottages. And I think it's amusing. I think it's that the West Coast, in a sense, is the last frontier, and it's there where people's final terrestrial visions could be expressed on this desert, which is now, they're in more palm trees now in Los Angeles than they're on the Sahara.
Well, I still say what you're mostly going to need out at L5 is ecologists and people who can deal with whole systems.
Absolutely.
On that question of presumptions, as we were talking yesterday about this Judeo-Christian morality, which is overlaid onto ecological perceptions, I see it as a calcified structure that genetically was programmed. Your response was, what is needed is consciousness of that.
Yeah.
And you offhandedly dropped the whole Judeo-Christian culture, which may leave some of the listeners wondering where it went to.
The Judeo-Christian thing is based on the fall. Got it? The fall. It's based on gravity. You want to know what original sin is? It's gravity. You want to know what the original grace is? It's levity.
Is the possibility of this obviously disintegrating ethic? I mean, as the pornography trials go around, as the drug trials go around, obviously the ethic is disintegrating. That the Judeo-Christian ethic, basically what it did is it restricted people from doing things until such time as the species evolved to enough consciousness to look at what it was encountering.
Absolutely.
So that a consciousness, a fluid consciousness of encounter
the Judeo-Christian philosophy was a very necessary philosophy to somehow socialize and civilize domesticated apes, because it's a domesticated ape philosophy. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Do not covet your neighbor's goods. I mean, come on. Is that the kind of philosophy that's going to lead us into glories of evolution? You know, it's a way to hold down the animals. And the very fact that it's existed for 2,000 years is testimony to the fact that it was necessary and that it worked. It allowed society to get together, to cooperate enough. That's a great thing of Christianity, that it taught us how to cooperate so that we could build the galleys and build the technology, which technology is simply extensions of our nervous system, to the point where we can evolve to the next stage. So the same thing is true, by the way, Buddhism. I often say, Buddhism was based on the discovery by the Buddha, who was a prince. Now, by prince, he means he was a middle-class young man that went to college because his family kept him from knowing the facts of life, just as most college students are kept away from the facts of life. Then he discovered, that great triple discovery of the Buddha, which led to a philosophy that's very powerful. He discovered death. He saw a dead man. He discovered illness. He never knew that existed. And he discovered aging. And he said, my God, if that's the bottom line of life, why should I bother to get my degree and become a prince and so forth? I'm going to drop out because life is meaningless, because the end point of life is disease, senility, impotence, and death. Now, that was a very powerful psychology for pre-scientific species of domesticated primates. But now, if the Buddha were alive today, he'd be majoring in biogenetics, and he would be reading Scientific American, and he would realize that death is no longer necessary, that disease is being rapidly eliminated, and that literally the only blocks to immortality are psychological. So Buddhism, as was true of the Judeo-Christian philosophy, was necessary at a time in our evolution, but we have to be aware that we're growing beyond that, and to repeat the old philosophies that just don't work today is a mistake. We revere them, we cherish them, but we've got to move on beyond them.
There's one technical difficulty that needs to be overcome, and one basic one that I'm thinking in terms of, which is that obviously the entire species, individual members of the entire species are not evolving at the same rate or not at the same state of evolution. Yet with the situation, at least in this country and most of the Western world, of electronic media, of mass distribution of information, we find a lot of people who are at evolutionary step, if you grade it from 1 to 10, evolutionary step 3, coming in contact with information from evolutionary step 7 and becoming quite agitated.
Yes.
And reacting on that plane hostily or whatever way. Is there a way to smooth over this transmission difficulty? Although
yes,
you did say being gentle.
Well, of course, you're putting your finger on one of the great occupational hazards of a genetic agent. In the 60s, we introduced, I'm the salesman for DNA Goat. When I say we, I'm speaking, of course, of the manufacturers, introduced the human body and the human brain as your own. We say, this is station, Timothy Leary Broadcasting Station, KDMA, and we offer you a 30 billion cell brain. We offer you a 5-circuit body for your pleasure, enjoyment, and for the enrichment of your life. Well, come on. The idea that consciousness was something that you could move and change, and the idea that your body was a time ship filled with all sorts of receptors that you weren't aware of and that could be tuned in and moved around for your pleasure and for your disciplined performance, this was an evolutionary idea. It did create a predictable reaction. And I think, though, that there has never been a cultural change in history that was as profound, as pervasive, and as bloodless as the Cultural Revolution of the 60s. The great thing about it was that it was done with humor, and it was done with compassion, and it was done with a lot of modesty. Of course, some of the hippies tended to be megalomaniac and messianic, but and that led to a few skulls being cracked. But by and large, it was a smiling revolution, and it was a levitational procedure. And by and large, I'm very proud of what happened in the 60s. Every aspect of our culture was reformed and revised and reviewed and improved. The same thing will happen as we move into the next evolutionary stages, which, as I say, are space migration and increased use of technology for neurological purposes. It's the function of the mutants to be totally aware of the anxieties they create in those they are leaving. Think of us as the advanced scouts for the entire human race. We're volunteering for this role. If we come to grief, if taking drugs does rot your head and break your chromosomes, snap and crack, then let us take the risks. We do it voluntarily. Watch us very carefully. Check us out. But keep open to us, and we'll keep feeding back our results to you, because that's our function as evolutionary pioneers.
As you go into space, what I would be looking for is the difficulties in coexisting with an artificial environment. However, I tend to think that we are ready for some kind of evolutionary step. For one thing, our methods of handling information have gotten a great deal more sophisticated. We have computers and we have ways of even thinking, conceptualizing information that are new. And, we're actually finding ways where the man in the street is actually beginning to be able to think in the way that Einstein did, and it's taken years, but there are vast implications for just being able to think and conceptualize your reality in a different way.
The television is an Einsteinian device because it produces a relativity of realities. The average American kid or the Western European kid who has access to a television in 1 week, by dialing and tuning, can experience more realities and a relativism of realities than the most widely traveled person did 100 years ago. So that's, I've been through all the liberal radical stages. Now at the moment, I've come to a position where I think the General Motors and Ford and those monolithic auto companies, blindly, without realizing what they were doing, performed a tremendous evolutionary task. They took peasant, domesticated primates off the farms, and in one generation put them behind the wheel of these rapidly moving things where they're shifting and talking about cylinders, and they're learning how to externalize their nervous system. So, and it got people on the idea of motion. It got them, it changed, as we know, the sexual mores, because you could get out in the back seat of a car. And granted that it's looked at the mass level, it seems plastic and it seems roboty, but I want to tell you, life on those farms was pretty roboty too.
You were talking about 5 circuits, the 60s. You were talking about the 60s and 5 circuits. And then I have neurologic, and you talk about 7 circuits there. Now I understand you're up to 8.
Yeah.
You've covered 4. Is there something different in nature about the 4 which follow? I'm wondering whether we are going into a phase of more conscious evolution, perhaps, or what is involved in the next 4 steps?
Well, the 5th, I've described the first 4 circuits of the nervous system, which every adult human terrestrial uses to get along. Then in the 60s, on a mass scale, a new circuit of the nervous system was activated, and we call this the 5th circuit, and it has to do with consciousness of the body and the brain as instruments you can use yourself. Now this was a rarity. In the past, only the nobility and the aristocracy and the big stars were able to say, my body is my own. It doesn't belong to the church or the state, and I can put whom and what I please in my own body and experience what I want with my own body. This was considered just totally impossible for the average person until the 60s. It did take a period of affluence and technological superfluity to allow the circuit to emerge. The 5th circuit of the nervous system is body consciousness, and certainly no one can quarrel with my statement that a tremendous new multi-billion-dollar industry is developed in this country, which you could call body consciousness. I'm talking about water beds and perfumes and scents and strange new textures, the whole notion of bubble baths, and I'm talking about diets and health foods. I'm talking about all the new yogas and the sense of, not to mention new sexuality and the varieties and the complexities of erotic behavior.
But it's the same thing that others would call decadence and compared to the last days of the Roman Empire.
It is true that in the past, it was at the moment of high imperial success that there was enough affluence and security from the four terrestrial circuits that the nobility could start playing with new forms of consciousness, and the nobility could announce their independence from the first four survival circuits. Now, in the past, this was survivally dangerous because the Romans would be developing their body consciousness. Meanwhile, the Medes and the Persians and the Huns and the Goths were at the doorstep. And this, of course, was the terror that haunted J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon and LBJ in the 60s. If our young people would rather do meditation and get high than fight in Vietnam, then we're in trouble, because they were thinking with rear-view mirror thinking that every great empire in the past, the Egyptian, the Persian, the Babylonian, the Greek, the Roman, and of course even the British Empire became very decadent as it passed the high point of its expansion. And that's rear-view mirror thinking. The thing that changes it all is that now, for the first time, we have something for the turned-on consciousness to do, and some place for them to go, and that's out. The problem in the 60s was you could get high, and you could have visions, you could reproduce the Buddha Hindu trips, you could see it all, and then you came down the next morning, and what was going on? The Vietnam War, racism, cultural catastrophes, and police repression, and there was this tremendous, literally no place to go. The great mutational step that's taken us from, given the Fifth Circuit someplace to go, was the Apollo lunar soil samples. Showed us that the moon was literally more than a gold mine. The moon has exactly the elements and minerals that are needed to build new worlds in space. Now, space migration is nothing, it's like building condominiums. It's no big deal at all. The space migration, to me and to O'Neill and to those people who are philosophically interested in it, simply provides an externalization of the visions of the 60s. But now, for the first time, we have some place to go where we can live out our new cultural visions. We can experiment with lifestyles. You can't do that on the surface of a shrinking planet with the population increasing. So space migration is tied to a consciousness movement of the 60s, which we call the Fifth Circuit activation. Is that clear?
Pretty clear. I'm really glad you mentioned that about the moon, because it's the fact that the moon is full of treasures is not very often brought out for some reason. Nobody stops to think that everything that you need to build a huge colony in space is available on the moon, and that it really doesn't take very much. It doesn't take very much fuel to lift off from the moon and move it back up to L5.
Yeah, it's literally, they say, it's about 100 times cheaper to build a beautiful garden condominium, a 5-acre per person place up there using lunar soil than it does to build a condominium for 10,000 people down here. Because you don't have gravity. That's the big issue, as you pointed out.
I don't know if there is any information stoppage from the various agencies that have been on the moon, but I'm reminded, as you said that, of the fact that back at the end of the last century, when John D. Rockefeller I was sent down to Pennsylvania by his boss to find out if this black goop that was coming out of the ground was worth anything, he looked it over, came back, and said it's worthless. There's no commercial potential.
Right.
And then proceeded, now I don't know that there's, or even suspect, an informational stoppage conspiracy, but there is that possibility. Maybe just because people don't.
Well, the L5 Society has made some real strides in making it known that good things are going on up there.
I agree with you in your analysis of the Rockefeller phenomena. The public doesn't realize that the moon is more than a gold mine for space migration. It's the most valuable piece of territory that that's ever existed. However, I make this flat prediction that in the research and development laboratories of every large aerospace and energy company in the world, they're studying the implications of the moon as soil samples, and they're thinking about it. Now, naturally, they're not talking about it. It's not. I don't believe in paranoid conspiracy theories. But still, there's no question that the real meaning and value of the lunar samples has not been broadcast to the American people. At this point, I think we should mention, with your permission, the L5 Society, which is a group of scientists and interested non-scientists who are publicizing and backing space migration. The L5 Society has a newsletter, and you can get in touch with them by writing L5, 1620 North Park Avenue. That's 1620 North Park Avenue, Tucson, Arizona. And they'll send you the L5 newsletter, which I find to be the most mind-blowing, life-changing publication that I've ever read.
Okay, let's keep moving up the ladder of these here circuits. Because we're only up to number 5 so far.
You want to take us high, or?
Yeah. We talked a little bit about number 5 being concerned with the body, the perception of the body time, and we talked about how you feel that the energy, that we can do something on Circuit 5 now, which was never before the case, and this distinguishes our society from the ancient Romans and their decadence. Where do we go outside of going to space? What comes after that?
The interesting thing is this. In no culture in history did you have what we now have, a consciousness movement. It's a multi-billion-dollar, TM and EST and the notion of personal growth, of consciousness raising. Every Girl Scout troop, meets once a week in the local grammar school for consciousness-raising sessions. The notion that you can grow and evolve in your own life, it's an old Oriental idea, which has now become very Americanized and is the key to the Fifth Circuit experience. But then what do you do? After you've centered your consciousness and got your stuff together and you're suntanned and you're polyphase orgasmed and you're self-actualized, and where do you go? Well, of course, my answer is we go to space, but then to go on to the Sixth Circuit of the nervous system, once we live in space, see, remember, we're living at the bottom of a 4,000-mile gravity swamp. We're literally crawling around like slugs in the bottom of this 4,000-mile atmosphere sea.
Energy trap.
It's an energy trap. Yeah, it takes only 1/billionth of the solar energy gets down to us through the Van Allen belt in the atmosphere. Not only that, it's hard to communicate. Down here, we have to use crude methods. We communicate by rubbing our vocal cords together, which creates sound waves, which are carried through this medium, this ocean that we live in. And I rub my vocal cords together, and it hits your eardrums. That's very mechanical. Such things as telepathy, neuroelectric communication, computer-brain link-up, and so forth cannot exist down here because we're at the bottom of the swamp. It's as though we were swimming underwater. We can't talk, because we go blah, 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 blah. That's. We try to use telepathy down here, but we can't because there's too much interference with gravity, electromagnetic racket, and the atmosphere itself. As soon as we live up in space, then the electricity, which we know exists in the brain, most likely can be used for a higher form of communication, which will not be muscular. I want to point out that everything we're doing down here is muscular. Even our language, our thought is muscular in the sense that it's artifacts that come from vocalisms. Up there, we will learn how to think and to communicate electro-neurologically. This is going to be one of the aspects that will develop, and the Sixth Circuit of our nervous system will be activated then. The interesting thing about mutation is this, and metamorphosis. And I'm going to tell you now one of the most impressive findings of science, which, of course, every school boy and girl knows. Within the DNA code of every caterpillar, and the DNA code is in every cell in the body of the caterpillar, is the blueprint for constructing the body and the nervous system of a butterfly. Now, in the DNA code of an infant, in each one of us, when we were babies in our mother's arms, in our DNA code was the blueprint for a sexually mature adult. And you didn't know how large your breasts were going to be, or you didn't know, exactly what your sexual physique would be, but your DNA code knew, although the little baby had no awareness of this. So that when we leave the surface of the planet, just as when we left our mother's arms or when we left the sea to crawl on the shoreline, the new circuits of our nervous system are going to be activated.